I'd like to begin to share a second similarity between the exercises and centering prayer. So let me go back to where I left off this morning. In my experience of the principle and foundation, I prayed for the grace to experience God's unconditional love. That grace was given to me. And then Father Barry encouraged me, as they do, to take a day off. And so he gave me the keys to his car, and I had a wonderful day of driving about the North Shore, the beauty of the North Shore of Massachusetts, right on the ocean. And so then I came back home, came back to the retreat center, slept like a baby, and the next morning after breakfast, went in to see Father Barry for my visit. And this is what he said to me. Now, Bill, now it is time for you to pray for the grace to experience the gift of your own sinfulness. At the time, I was probably 32 or 33, and that was the first time in my entire life up to that moment that anyone suggested that it is a grace to pray to experience your own woundedness, your own sinfulness, your own brokenness. But at this particular point, I absolutely trusted Father Barry and his direction. And so I took to heart the grace that he invited me to pray for. And I really spent the entire day praying for the grace to experience my own sinfulness. And what began to unfold as I prayed for that grace was that the feelings of consolation, the feelings of being loved by God, slowly but surely faded away. And as the day wore on, rather than consolation, I began to feel the desolation that Ignatius speaks of, the desolation that allowed me to feel very arid, very barren, very much as though I were in the desert with little or no support. So it was a very, very difficult day. And when I went in to see Father Barry the next morning for my daily visit, I shared with him that experience. And he simply said to me, Bill, continue to pray for the grace to experience your own sinfulness. And so now, in the midst of this aridity and this desert-like feeling, I moved into a second day of praying for that grace. And as the day unfolded, nothing seemed to be presented experientially other than the feeling of dryness, or aridity. And just before the end of the day, short time after supper, when I was moving into another period of prayer, the only experience that I had was an image of my brother-in-law presented itself. And then the next morning, again, that was all I had to share with Father Barry, with Father Bill. And he basically said to me, pray over that image of your brother-in-law. So I'm going to take a little side detour for just a moment. It was in 1952. Now this is 1956. It was in 1952 that my sister and brother-in-law were living in St. Louis, Missouri. My brother-in-law was a chemical engineer, and that's where he was employed. And they had one little girl, my niece. And my sister was pregnant with their second child. And this was in February of 1952. And when my sister delivered their second child, my brother-in-law called my family, called my mom, to let her know the good news. And his message was, mother and daughter are doing fine. Everything is okay. Now, the following July in 1952, my sister, brother-in-law, and the two babies came home to Massachusetts. And while they were home on vacation, they stayed with my family. And one evening, I was out socially. At the time, I believe I was a sophomore in high school, St. John's Prep in Danvers. And I needed someone to pick me up because we had no public transportation at that time. And so it was my brother-in-law that picked me up. And on the way home, driving back home, he begins to tell me that shortly after my sister gave birth to my second niece, complications set in, and my sister almost died. And then he began with more and more anger and rage, began to tell me that none of us really cared. And all I could hear myself say, but you said everything was okay. And he kept going on and on. And by the time I got home, he had demonized my mom and dad, my family. And I don't think I've ever been more emotionally upset in my entire life. And I remember going into the house and saying to my sister and my mother at the time that he was done, that he's out of my life. And for the next day, my poor sister is coming to me and begging me to give him a chance to apologize. And I said, absolutely not, he's done. And then the following day, they were returning to St. Louis. So I went out to the car to say goodbye to my sister and my two nieces, the babies. And my brother-in-law and I went through kind of a perfunctory shaking of the hand. And that was the experience I had in 1952. And now we're in 1976. I'm praying for the grace to experience my own sinfulness. The image of my brother-in-law presents itself. Father Barry encourages me to pray over that image of my brother-in-law. And what I've just described is precisely what began to unfold as I prayed over that image of my brother-in-law. And not only the memory, excuse me, not only the memory of that event returned front and center, but all of my affectivity, my feelings, my anger, my rage, all of that came back in living color. And that's how I presented myself to Father Bill the following morning. And all he said to me was, and here is the sin, here is the wound. Father Bill said to me, well, pray for the grace to forgive your brother-in-law. And immediately I said to him, I will not. Coming out of that vivid return of that memory. And all Father Bill did was to repeat what he had said. You pray for the grace to forgive your brother-in-law. And because at this point I trusted him so much, I did what he encouraged me to do. And that grace was given. I was able, truly able, from the depths of my heart, to offer that forgiveness to my brother-in-law for the deep hurt, the pain that 1952 encounter had upon me and had been so repressed for these many, many years. So the grace was given. And I don't want to give you the impression that my brother-in-law and I ever became very, very close. No buddy-buddy. But this was 1976. And in 1981, he died very unexpectedly at 58. And the grace of that ability to forgive allowed me, they were living in Peabody, Massachusetts at the time. I was able to go to Peabody to be with my family, to be with my sister and her children during the wake, during the massive resurrection. I was able to simply be present without any residual anger or upset with my brother-in-law. I could simply be present in a loving, passionate, or loving pastoral way. So what St. Ignatius is saying, and what we really need to absorb, is that when we pray, having received the gift of God's unconditional love, and when we pray for the grace to experience our own woundedness or sinfulness, it is in that moment that God's healing love touches the wound, touches the depth of our hurt. And what we begin to experience in the words of St. Ignatius is that we are, through the grace of God, through the love of God, we are saved sinners. That's Ignatius's term. And the emphasis is never on the sin. The emphasis is always on the experience of God's saving love meeting us and penetrating that deep wound that we have absorbed through whatever the experience may be. So this is what Ignatius is saying. Through the principle and foundation, through the experience of our sinfulness, we are saved sinners, God loving us in the midst of our sin. And the fruit of that experience is an experience of gratitude and joy. We're experiencing the saving love of our God, and gratitude is the only response. And then Ignatius goes on to say that it is in that spirit of gratitude, gratitude for having experienced the gift of God's saving love, that Jesus comes and says to each one of us, out of this lived experience, Jesus says, "Come, follow me." And the rest of the spiritual exercises would be an opportunity to follow Jesus all the way to Jerusalem, to learn from him, so that through that learning, we begin to put on the mind and the heart of Christ. And then we participate once again in the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. And through Christ's resurrection, we again share in God's victory over sin and death. So those two moments in the exercises, the principle and foundation, the experience of being saved sinner, I want to take just a moment to again describe the similarity. How do we experience within the practice of centering prayer that, in the words of Ignatius, we are saved sinners? So let's, for a moment, looking at the similarity, let's for a moment go back in the context of our centering prayer, go back to our inner room. We're invited again and again to enter our inner room, to find the place of our hearts. And in that first moment of unconditional love, we are consenting intentionally to God's love, to God's presence, to God's action. And we continue to persevere in choosing to consent whenever we may feel distracted or caught up in one or other of our thoughts, we gently return to the symbol of our consent, consenting to God's love, to God's presence, to God's action. As that experience unfolds from within the depths of our inner room, day in, day out, what begins to happen interiorly is that our capacity to trust the one who is loving us so lavishly, so generously, so wholeheartedly, just loving us, and in consenting and receiving the ongoing gift of God's unconditional love interiorly, our capacity to trust the one who is loving us grows and deepens within our lived experience. And when trust is more firmly rooted, when we're more grounded in our capacity to trust this God who is a God of unconditional love, it is in this moment or through this process that God's love, like a laser beam, begins to penetrate, to permeate what we would describe, or what Father Thomas Keating described, as the wounds of a lifetime, the wounds that we have absorbed simply through the process of living our lives. God's laser beam of love begins to penetrate and to permeate that wound. And that experience becomes what Thomas Keating described as an evacuation, as an unloading. You know, the pain of that moment presents itself in the form of highly charged emotional thoughts. The thoughts come up, we yield, we surrender, we let go. And through that letting go, we're allowing God the opportunity, in response to God's love, to permeate that wound at its very core. So this is how, in the practice of centering prayer, in this second movement, so to speak, we begin to become aware that we too are saved sinners, God embracing us in the very experience of our human vulnerability, our weaknesses, at times our sinfulness. God is seeking, in response to God's love, to love us into wholeness. And that's what we're consenting to within the practice of centering prayer. But I just wanted to, in this time together, just to show those two similarities, the experience of unconditional love flowing out of the experience of unconditional love, the healing, the ongoing process of being healed by a God who loves us. And I would suggest that probably the most concrete way, at least in my experience, that Father Thomas helps us to become aware that we are saved sinners is in his particular description of what he identifies as the four consents. That's Father Thomas Keating's developmental model based on Erik Erikson's. developmental model. Thomas simply synthesized the stages of human growth in and development into this experience of 4 consents. So what Thomas goes on to say is that we are invited to make our first consent developmentally, as God invites us to consent to the gift of our being. Consent to the gift of our being. And then the second consent is consenting to the gift of our creative and of our sexual energy. And then the third consent is a willingness to consent to our mortality, the aging process. And then the fourth consent is God's invitation to be willing to die to the false self system that permeates each of these prior consents. But what I find so helpful is that Father Thomas goes on to point out that when we are navigating a particular consent, for example, consenting to the gift of our being, at the time of that consent, we have already absorbed a certain degree of hesitancy relative to the fundamental goodness of our being. Oftentimes, the little baby absorbing even nonverbals, the mom, the dad, they're tired, they're worn out. When they pick up the child, this is what the child feels. And so it creates a sense of hesitancy relative to its own fundamental goodness. And then moving on to the second consent, consenting to the experience of our creative and of our sexual energy. So many of us around this particular consent can absorb so much hesitancy, rooted more in fear than anything else around this particular consent. And that fear of our sexuality becomes a hesitancy that blocks our capacity to embrace this second consent. And then moving on to the third consent, consenting to the gift of our mortality. Again, the fear of diminution, the fear that we're going to lose our independence through the aging process, the fear of what might happen, all of that creates a kind of hesitancy that makes it difficult for us to embrace the gift of our mortality. So those are the hesitancies that create the wounds of a lifetime that our body and our psyche absorbs. And then Father Thomas goes on to point out that there comes a point where Jesus, as divine healer, invites us to accompany him on an archaeological dig. And Jesus invites us to go back through each stage of our human growth and development, And on whatever hesitancy may be present, Jesus, as divine healer, invites us to surrender, to let go, to give him that hesitancy so that through the surrender, Jesus, as divine healer, can penetrate that hesitancy with God's love, healing the wound that we may carry relative to that particular consent. And so this is how I believe, within the context of centering prayer, we begin to experience, as Ignatius points out, that through the grace of God and in response to God's love, we are saved sinners. And the emphasis is on God's saving love. And again, it's within that frame of mind and heart, as he does in the exercises, so Jesus does within the context of centering prayer, where he invites us to follow him. He invites us through the practice of centering prayer, that willingness to consent, that willingness to receive the inflow of God's love. Jesus is inviting us to deepen in our capacity to grow in our relationship with a God who has chosen to love us first. God's love is foundational, and God's love initiates this process. And as I mentioned at the beginning, from where I sit, it's a process of falling in love. And so I think at that point, we can, if there are any questions or